Chapter 28 Biogeochemical Cycling and Ecosystem Productivity. Section 28.3 The Carbon and Nitrogen Cycles. So let's now look at two particular nutrients in detail in terms of how they cycle, their nutrient cycles. And we're going to look at carbon, and it's an important nutrient cycle. Of course, all life is based on carbon. Most organisms are 50% carbon. And then we're going to look at nitrogen. Nitrogen is also another important nutrient. It plays a very important role in forming proteins, nucleic acids, and DNA. So let's begin by looking at carbon. As I said, all life is based on carbon. Carbon is a major constituent of organic matter. It makes up fossil fuels, complex molecules like DNA and RNA. That are used to control the reproduction of organisms. Yet by weight, if we looked at the Earth's crust, carbon is not, in a relative sense, an abundant element. It's actually quite rare. The following diagram shows the major stores and the mechanisms that move carbon from one store to another. So the major stores here are the atmosphere carbon store, the ocean carbon store, the lithosphere carbon store, which consists of things like marine deposits, limestone and dolomite, coal, oil, and gas, and then the biosphere carbon store. Now in the biosphere, carbon is stored in living biomass. It's also stored in dead organic matter that is undergoing decay, and there is a huge store of carbon in decaying organic matter in the soil layer. Some of the processes that move carbon around, so we can see there's a factory there burning fossil fuels, so we're moving oil and gas, or coal that was once stored in coal, oil and gas back to the atmosphere store. We can see that photosynthesis takes carbon from the atmosphere or from the ocean store and adds it to biomass. Biomass returns carbon through the processes of respiration and decomposition, and so on. These are some of the major processes involved in the movement of carbon between the major stores. So as I said, carbon is stored in the following major stores, or another term that's used, sinks. So it's stored as organic molecules in living and dead organisms found in the biosphere. Carbon is stored as a gas in the atmosphere, also in the oceans as a gas. It's stored in organic matter in soils. And some of that organic matter might be alive, right? It might be decomposing organisms, or it could just be dead organic matter that's about to be decomposed. It's stored in the lithosphere as fossil fuels and sedimentary rock deposits such as limestone, dolomite, and chalk. And in the oceans, as I said, it exists in a dissolved form and in various types of carbonate and calcium carbonate. And of course, calcium carbonate is used to make shells in marine organisms. So here are some of the amounts associated with these stores in billions of metric tons. So in the atmosphere, prior to industrialization, 578, by 2005, 794. I don't know what the value is for today, but of course it would be higher. In soil organic matter, the amount of carbon stored is estimated between 1,500 and 1,600 billions of metric tons. Huge store of carbon in the ocean, 38,000 to 40,000. Marine sediments and sedimentary rocks, huge store in the millions. And then terrestrial plants, anywhere from 540 to 610 billion metric tons. And then finally, fossil fuel deposits, estimated at about 4 billion metric tons of carbon stored in those substances. Ecosystems gain most of their carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And then it gets passed on when plants are consumed by herbivores, and then herbivores consumed by carnivores. So as we know what photosynthesis is, it's the addition of carbon dioxide, water, and energy from the sun to produce a basic organic molecule known as sugar or glucose, and that's done in chloroplasts. Carbon dioxide enters the oceans by simple diffusion. So, and the amount that can move into the oceans is a function of seawater temperature. When temperatures get colder, more can be stored, which is the opposite of what you would think. When oceans get warmer, they have less of an ability to hold carbon, and so they release it to the atmosphere. And we learned that in Chapter 9 when we were talking about climate cycles and climate change. Once dissolved in seawater, carbon dioxide can remain, or it can be converted into carbonate or bicarbonate. Certain forms of sea life biologically fix bicarbonate with calcium to produce calcium carbonate, which is used to build shells and, of course, skeletons in things like fish and other marine organisms. When plants and other organisms die, their bodies sink to the ocean floor. Their bodies can be composed of shells or bone, and these deposits accumulate and create carbonate-rich deposits that over time can be converted geologically due to physical and chemical alteration into sedimentary rocks. Ocean deposits are the second biggest sink of carbon on our planet, and of course the biggest is sedimentary rocks, dolomite, limestone, and etc. Carbon is released from ecosystems as a gas, CO2, by the process of respiration. And of course, don't forget, respiration is not something that just takes place in animals. Plants do it too. So for plants to do metabolic activity, they have to break down some of the glucose that they've created in order to release the energy to do that metabolism. So respiration involves the breakdown of carbon-based organic molecules into carbon dioxide gas and some other products that are released into the atmosphere or the soil. Carbon is stored in the lithosphere in both inorganic and organic forms. Rock would be inorganic. Organic would be soil sediments that are rich in organic matter. Inorganic deposits of carbon include things like coal, oil, natural gas, oil shale, carbonate-based sedimentary rocks like limestone. Organic forms of carbon in the lithosphere, we're talking about in the soil layer and other sediment layers near the surface of the earth or in the oceans at the surface of their surface, include litter, organic matter, and humic substances found in soils. Sometimes carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere from the interior when magma flows through limestone rocks, and we can get emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when this occurs. Now, of course, humans have played an important role in modifying the carbon cycle. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, we have increased the concentration of carbon dioxide found in the atmosphere and the oceans. And this is because of burning fossil fuel and also by changing natural stores of carbon in biomass by replacing forests with cropland, for example. Atmospheric levels have increased by over 40%. So they were around 275 parts per million in the 1700s, and today they're over 400, approaching 410 now in parts per million. Scientists estimate that future atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide could reach anywhere between 450 and 600 parts per million by 2100. It depends on how quickly we move from a fossil fuel-based way of getting the energy we need to run our society to using renewable energy sources like wind, solar power, tide power, and hydro. Emissions from fossil fuel combustion account for about 65% of the additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and as I said, the other contributing, or the other thing that's contributing to carbon in the atmosphere is the conversion of natural ecosystems into agricultural systems. It's responsible for about 35%, with most of that being deforestation, being the transfer. Okay, that ends the carbon cycle. It's relatively easy. This cycle, the nitrogen cycle, is a little bit more difficult to understand. And of course, I put it in here because it is also a very important nutrient cycle. And it's a nutrient cycle that humans have altered to a great deal. Nitrogen is used by living organisms to produce a number of complex organic molecules, including amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Of course, those nucleic acids are used to build DNA and RNA. So this diagram represents the nitrogen cycle and the major stores and the major processes that move nitrogen from one store to another. Now, this one, as I said, is a little trickier, and we're going to see that nitrogen exists in so many different chemical forms in this cycle. So we know that 78% of the gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen, mainly as N2 gas, and this store of nitrogen is very important to life. So the atmospheric store is about 1 million times larger than the total nitrogen store in living organisms. Now, most plants can only take up nitrogen in solid forms, in the form of ammonium ion, NH4, or in the form of nitrate, that's nitrate ion, in the form of NO3. So how does the gas, N2, how is it converted into these forms? So that's what I'm going to show you. For my PhD, I studied how nitrogen influences tidal marshes and whether or not it was a limiting nutrient. So you can see this little plot here where I did some nitrogen fertilization with urea, and it indicated that yes, the plants were short of nitrogen and grew much better with higher levels of nitrogen. Animals receive the nitrogen they require for metabolism by eating plants or dead organic matter. In most ecosystems, nitrogen is primarily stored in either living or dead organic matter. And decomposers found in the upper soil layer can modify nitrogen found in organic matter to create ammonia, NH3, and then convert that ammonia to ammonium salts, NH4. But those, of course, aren't forms that plants want to take up with their roots from the soil layer. They want it either in the form of, well, actually ammonium salts is. They also want it in the form of nitrates. So the conversion of organic matter to ammonium salts is called mineralization. Mineralization is carried out by a variety of bacteria, actinomycetes, and fungi. This nitrogen has a positive charge to it, so it can be stored in the soil layer for long periods of time on clay particles. But notice that nitrates and nitrites are negatively charged. They can't be stored for very long in the soil layer. They need to be taken up quite quickly or they're lost due to leaching. So most of the ammonium is chemically altered to a specific by a specific type of autotrophic bacteria called nitrosomus. So it converts the ammonium into nitrite. Now nitrite can't be used by plants. It's actually toxic to plants. So it has to be converted into that other form, nitrate. So that gets kind of confusing. Nitrate, nitrate. So NO2 to NO3 negative. So here we see, the storage of nutrients on clay micelles. So most of the nutrients that plants require, calcium, magnesium, sodium, has positive charge, so they're easily stored on clay micelles. The only form of nitrogen that can be held by clay micelles is the ammonium salts. NO3 and NO3, which is nitrate, and NO2, nitrite, can't be held by these clay micelles and floats around in the soil water and is often lost or easily lost due to leaching. But plants do have their roots down in the soil, and they're always looking for it, and they will absorb it if it's available, if they have enough time. So how do we get NO2 into NO3? Well, we need another bacteria. And this bacteria belongs to the genus Nitrobacter. So Nitrobacter converts nitrite, NO2, into nitrate, NO3. Both of these processes involve chemical oxidation and are known as nitrification. Now, as I said, nitrate and nitrite are very soluble and easily lost from the soil system by leaching. There's another thing that can happen to various forms of nitrogen. Nitrate can be converted into nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide by a process called denitrification. And this involves another group of bacteria, but this occurs usually in anaerobic environments. Flooded environments cause this conversion. Almost all of the nitrogen found in any terrestrial ecosystem originally came from the atmosphere. One way that it can be converted into solid forms is by lightning. So lightning, the high temperatures can convert NO2 gas into solid forms of nitrogen, and they can fall to the surface of the earth via rainfall. However, the majority of nitrogen enters ecosystems by symbiotic relationships with bacteria, actinomycetes, and cyanobacteria with other plants or alone. So they breathe in the nitrogen and produce solid forms of nitrogen that can then be used by plants. Sometimes, and most of the time, it's in a symbiotic relationship. So they trade some nitrogen for some yummy glucose, right? They're sugar addicts. Those bacteria, actinomycetes and cyanobacteria. Now, as I said, humans have altered the nitrogen cycle severely, and there's four main ways that we've altered the nitrogen cycle. And number one is the application of nitrogen fertilizers to crops. We now have to grow large amounts of crops. Nitrogen is a limiting nutrient. The only way in many ways, the only way we can get these crops to grow is by fertilizing the soil surface with nitrogen. But a lot of this nitrogen never really reaches the plants, or not nitrogen, but 40% reaches the plants. A lot of it is lost due to denitrification and leaching into the groundwater. We're also causing an increased deposition of nitrogen because of fossil fuels. Use of fossil fuels and forest burning that's caused by us. So this creates nitrogen that then falls out later on downwind. Livestock ranching. Livestock release large amounts of ammonia through their wastes, and livestock can cause an increase in nitrogen in the soil and in aquatic systems where the groundwater flows into them. And then, of course, one of the ways that we process our waste, either through sewage plants or septic tanks, creates nitrogen, and this can leach into the environment and cause pollution problems.